Well, the kid got added to my class, but my role is way past 32.
This is Steve Zeltzer with Work Week, and today we're going to be covering the struggle in public education in San Francisco and Oakland, and their threats now using the threat of a state takeover at SFUSD and Oakland's Unified School District. And joining us today is Jack Gerson, who is a retired member of the Oakland Education Association and also was a representative to the CTA and has some familiarity with Vincent Matthews.
In addition to being one of OEA's delegates to the State Council of the California Teachers Association, I was on their Executive Board and bargaining team at the time that Matthews was the state administrator. And I was on the Financing Public Education Committee of CTA State Council. So I was quite familiar with what this guy did. And it's very interesting because much of what was done in Oakland, I'm afraid, will be done to San Francisco already. Some of that's in progress. I think the place to begin with the specific attack of the state takeover of the Oakland schools is with the Democratic Party. In late 2002, SB 39, State Senate Bill 39, authored by one Don Parada, the state senator from Oakland, a Democrat, and at that time he was the president pro tem of the California Senate, which enabled the Superintendent of Public Instruction to take over directly on name, designate an administrator to run the Oakland School District, ostensibly because Oakland was $37 million in debt. The enabling legislation also allowed for a loan, which turned out to be $100 million to the district. And the school board lost all power. All power went to the state administrator, who could decide by a vote of 1-0 to do anything. Had power over all contracts, over all employees. He could lay off and fire, and did. Now, who was appointed and how? Just one little more piece of background. In that fall of 2002, there was an election for the state superintendent of public instruction. A Democratic assemblyman, Jack O'Connell, ran. Now, in previous elections, there'd be a budget of maybe between $50,000 and $100,000 total, usually for all candidates running in those elections. In this election, $500,000 was donated to Mr. O'Connell by 3 individuals. Eli Broad, who brought in the other 2. Eli Broad is a Los Angeles billionaire and one of the major architects of the privatization, assault on public education, with charter schools and teach to the test, high stakes standardized tests, and so on, paying teachers based on student test scores, merit pay, supposedly. So Broad brought in 2 of his friends. One of them, Reed Hastings, was the president of the state school board at the time, also the founder of Aspire Charter Schools, the CEO of Netflix. And the other one was a guy named John Doerr, D-O-E-R-R. John Doerr was Mr. Silicon Valley Venture Capital, the venture capitalist behind the funding, the initial funding of Google, the initial funding of Amazon. And at this time, and very close to the Apple leadership, Mr. Big in the Silicon Valley. At One Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park, he established the New School Venture Fund, a incubator for charter schools and a conduit for funding from billionaires like himself, but especially Eli Broad. We will see that an employee of his at some point for a few years was one Vincent Matthews, but we'll go on. So they bought the election for Jack O'Connell with their $500,000 donation. O'Connell turned around and together with consulting with the then mayor of Oakland, one Jerry Brown, appointed, it gets worse and worse, appointed Randolph Ward to be the state administrator, Eli Broad to name the state administrator. And Broad handpicked Randolph Ward, Randy Ward, then a student in Eli Broad's Urban Superintendent Academy. The Urban Superintendent Academy has at this point trained more than 1,000 administrators for high-level positions as superintendents, deputy superintendents, and so on for urban school districts around the country. Randy Ward came in 2003, in the summer of 2003, immediately imposed a 4% pay cut on all Oakland Unified School District employees. Unfortunately, it was accepted by the union which is a whole story about how that was pushed through a vote when most teachers were on vacation, but I won't get into that right now. The upshot was that he laid off a large number of staff, especially maintenance staff, janitors, the people who did the school maintenance, like repairing broken windows, painting, and so on. Maintenance outside of janitorial, the electricians and painters and so on, they were cut from over 70 down to fewer than 20. It's shameful. And the schools were in complete disrepair, especially the schools in the flatlands, in the largely Black and brown areas, high poverty areas of Oakland. The state came in ostensibly because it was a $37 million debt. What did they do in the 6 years of the state takeover, 2003 to 2009? When they came in, there were 52,000 students in public schools. When they left, there were 37,000 students in public schools. Now there are 34,000 in Oakland public schools. They destroyed essentially, public education. They decimated, the district. There were the layoffs to employees, but there were also cuts in programs. So at Castlemont High School, where I taught, they eliminated French, they eliminated computers, they eliminated the vocational programs, the shops, which was self-funding and award-winning. The Construction Academy, Wood Shop, the Culinary Academy, the Fashion Academy. Those were providing jobs in East Oakland to 18-year-old graduates who couldn't get jobs any other way, where the unemployment rate for 18-year-old males was 70–80%. Those were shut down. I mean, we're talking about, a real destruction of a community, taking an already unstable situation and drastically increasing the instability. So they did all these cuts. So you would think, well, certainly they would have, then saved the district's finances. But no, they tripled the debt. When they left, the debt was $111 million, 3 times the $37 million deficit that they came in supposedly to fix. How could they do that when they made so many cuts? Well, they were handing out money like water to contractors, and I'm trying not to use hyperbole, to private contractors, so that by 2009, the average of per capita of outsourced contracting in the Oakland Unified School District was double that, twice that of the average per capita for California school districts. They brought in their friends and padded the number of high-paying administrative positions for those who weren't getting contracts, and they made them direct employees and increased the salary steeply, so that administrative overhead by 2009 was, again, also double that for the average California school district. This is how the state, under democratic control, fix things. And then they have the audacity to sue the school district for millions of dollars for not having too many administrators relative to the number of teachers in the 2006-2007 school year. Who was in charge of the district in the 2006-2007 school year? Hint, the state takeover was from 2003 to 2009. So this is completely shameful. Randy Ward, the first state administrator, was in office from 2003 to 2006. He left to go to San Diego as the county superintendent of public instruction there in 2006. And his job was taken by a woman named Kimberly Statham. She had graduated from the Broad Urban Superintendent's Academy at the same time as Randy Ward. She was the superintendent of one of the suburban counties near Washington, D.C., but got caught up in a scandal when she leaned on teachers and administrators there to increase the grade for her daughter. And it became a big scandal, and they had to try to sanitize her. Eli Broad stands up for his people and brought her out to Oakland to run things here, which she did for a year. But Statham really wanted to be back home. She was flying in every Tuesday morning and flying out every Thursday and needed someone to take over. She brought in Vincent Matthews as chief of staff, and she brought him in winter 2006-2007. And he took over when she, after only a year in office, she left to go back to the Washington, D.C. area to become the chief academic officer, reporting to her boss, newly appointed Washington, D.C. superintendent of schools, Michelle Ray. You may remember Michelle Ray, the founder of Teach for America, one of the arch enemies of teacher unionism, students, parents. Okay, so Matthews becomes the third and it turns out the final state administrator of Oakland Unified School District. And 2.5 years later, at the end of the 2008-2009 school year, nominal at least, local control is returned in Oakland, but Matthews doesn't leave. His title changes. He's no longer the state administrator. He's now the state trustee with the power to stay or rescind anything having to do with money in OUSD. He can stay means that he can reject any contract proposal, and rescind means that he can throw them out even after they're accepted. I was on the bargaining team at the time, and it was clear to us that Matthews, acting behind the scenes, was vetoing any attempt at even a modest agreement that would be offered by the school administration, by their bargaining team. So he played that role in 2009-2010. So he stood up for outsourcing, for administrative bloat, and for cutting academic programs, and for clobbering teacher unions. We got imposed upon while he was the state trustee. Imposition is very rarely done. It means that not only weren't we given a decent contract, we weren't working under contract at all. They imposed terms on us. They were able to impose their supposedly last best offers. There were no good offers. And that was done under Matthews. So there were, remember, the wages had been cut 4% under Ward when he came in. We had just barely gotten that back. And then Matthews imposes this long-term wage freeze. Matthews as the state trustee. Okay, then he leaves in 2010. Oh, and I left out one thing about what was going on in Oakland. I said that public school enrollment fell from 52,000 to 37,000 under the state takeover, and now 34,000. When the state took over in 2003, charter school enrollment was 2,000. When Randy Ward left in the middle of the state takeover in 2006, it was already over 8,000. It quadrupled in 3 years. When Matthews left in 2010, it was close to 15. It was about 12 to 14,000, I think about 12,000. And now it's well over 15,000. Oakland's had the highest percentage of any large urban school district of charter schools in the state. Oakland has been a laboratory for privatization. And Matthews, was one of the main research scientists involved in that experiment. So in 2010, Matthews went to San Jose Unified, where he actually stayed. One of the few places he stayed. He stayed until September 2015, and seems to have been in that job pretty much a run-of-the-mill superintendent. I don't have a lot on that, and I'm going to skip over it, because there may be more, because I want to go to the next time he came in, which is in for the state, which is he came into the Inglewood Unified School District in September of 2015 as the state administrator. Again, I think he was the third state administrator in Inglewood, which was under state control starting in 2012. He left to go to San Francisco in 2017. And I have a quote there. A year later or so, the LA Times did a postmortem on the job he did there. March 2017, Matthews returns to San Francisco as superintendent. Matthews left day-to-day tasks to consultants. Sound familiar? Very little was spent on school buildings in need of serious repair, despite tens of millions of dollars earmarked for facility upgrades being available. Inglewood's enrollment declined by more than a third in the decade, including the years when he was there. It declined under him, and it continued to decline after. Inglewood had a state debt. It owed money to the state and was being clamped down on, like Oakland, and as they want to do with San Francisco, for its deficit. He was appointed the Inglewood Unified School District State Administrator by liberal Democrat State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson, who had appointed the previous administrators. So the liberal Democrats, Jack O'Connell in 2003 with Oakland, Tom Torlakson with Inglewood, and all the others worked hand in hand with Eli Broad and Broad's acolytes, because Vince Matthews was clearly a paid agent of the privatizers and the Eli Broad specific wing of them. There's one other thing which we could go into. I think you have a video of this, Steve, this meeting on the Onatoff mural, in which Matthews played a sanctioning role. The mural at Washington, George Washington High School.
Matthews said he was shocked by that mural. He'd never seen it before. And it had to go, and he supported the school board spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover it up, destroy it. And apparently they've used bond money in that purpose as well. But why don't we talk about Vince Matthews' history in the San Francisco Unified School District, what he did there when he was running a school.
Matthews was the principal of a school in San Francisco. That school was the for-profit Thomas Edison Charter School. In 2001, there was a huge fight. The community and the school board were allied against Edison Charter and Vincent Matthews. Matthews and Edison Charter were accused of bias towards especially Black students in admissions policy, of selective admissions, which would keep out Black students, and in force outs, in forcing out students with low grades, disproportionately Black students. There was a big fight about this and about other aspects of this for-profit charter, wanting to get their charter revoked. The upshot of it was, I think that there was a decision by the school board to remove the charter, and then the state intervened, as the state does, on the side of Edison Charter, but Matthews decided to wash his hands of it. So after running the show on this for-profit charter schools, by the way, this for-profit charter school operation, Edison, Chris Whittle was the CEO, the major domo of it. They tried various ways to milk money from education. They weren't able to make enough in their school running their own schools directly. Philadelphia gave them half the schools in Philadelphia to run, and they ran them in the same austerity way that Matthews ran their for-profit charter. In July of 2001, Matthews left to take a job as principal of Dewey High School in Oakland. But he didn't get to see many students at Dewey because he was there for the summer. School opened, and a couple of weeks later, Matthews left. He returned to Edison Charter, who promoted him to vice president of West Coast operations. So this is a man who's clearly, very concerned with the well-being, of underprivileged students. And San Francisco certainly chose wisely in bringing him in 2017. You've heard a bit about his track record. Why was someone like this brought in to San Francisco? The first go, he had to go around in a for-profit charter school we just talked about. There was his heinous role in Oakland, and then his role in Inglewood. What has to be done? Why do these people keep being chosen? Why are they foisted upon the community and the students and the teachers?
And the former president of UESF, Susan Solomon, apparently did not know about his records.
The San Francisco Chronicle article on it says that Susan Solomon said that the union wasn't intimately familiar with him, but they were impressed by his background. Well, first of all, anyone who even checked, let's assume a short memory, because Susan Solomon was around in San Francisco in 2001 when this fight was going on, and active in the union, right? But let's assume, a memory blip here. It doesn't take much to go enter the name Vincent Matthews Schools, San Francisco, or just Vincent Matthews Schools, and find out all about this. I did it yesterday, and I got more articles than I could possibly process, and more dirt than could possibly be recited here. So the reason that she didn't, I'm afraid, is willful. That is, they didn't want to know. They didn't want to comment. They're looking. Most of the teacher union leadership at the state and national levels, unfortunately, and many local, want to be collaborative. That's their watchword. We need to be collaborative with district leadership. But district leadership is not our friend, is not the friend of the rank and file teacher or of teacher unions.
And we have today the role of the CTA and CFT supporting Tony Thurmond, who they say was going to be pro-teacher. What has been the role of Tony Thurmond, and isn't he in charge of the State Board of Education and imposing these trusteeships?
Yes, I think you know that he is, Steve. And yes, that is his role.
I mean, the fact is they're using the state takeover, possible state takeover of the Oakland Unified School District and San Francisco Unified School District with the threat of a state takeover unless they have massive budget cuts. Yet it seems that Tony Thurmond's name hasn't come up in any of the material by the unions, either UESF or OEA, about Tony Thurmond and who he is and what his role is.
Yes. In fact, CTA, CFT, OEA, and I believe UESF heavily funded Tony Thurmond's campaign for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. DSA was extremely supportive, went around canvassing for Tony Thurmond. By the way, CTA also, the $500,000 that funded Jack O'Connell in 2003 was supplemented by $100,000 from CTA. So this is nothing new. This is an ongoing policy. The state loans that are imposed could have been the $100 million in Oakland. Remember the state tripled the debt in Oakland, so they should have excused, that debt, or at least the amount that they increased at $74 million. The state legislature, Democrat controlled, had no intention of doing that. So, so Tony Thurmond played a role in the Oakland teacher strike, and I believe also in the Los Angeles teacher strike, but certainly more in the Oakland teacher strike, of essentially brokering a deal, making sure that the strike ended and that the deal, that only at best a moderate deal was won, that much more could have been gained. And through his connection with CTA and the OEA leadership, was able to push that through.
And one of the reasons that the teachers union and teachers were supporting him, of course, he was going against a even more right-winger open charter advocate, was that he was going to deal with charters. How did Tony Thurmond deal with charters? I understand he set up a committee to investigate charters.
Yeah, so I would have to look back, but he set up a committee to investigate charters. And I wrote something up on that, which I could dredge out.
He actually appointed charter
he appointed
advocates.
more charter advocates than opponents to that committee, a majority of charter advocates. Diane Ravitch on her website, was the first, I think, to immediately detailed it. And I actually went in and found more information on them. These were major players in the charter school industry, not just somebody who said, yeah, I think maybe I like charter schools, but big executives of charter school archipelagos, for example. I mean, really, really gross. So,
And
yeah.
now they're threatening the school districts that unless you make these cuts, we're going to have a trusteeship come in. The CTA and the CFT represent the school teachers in California. Why haven't they said that this is a joint campaign, a joint attack to defend the schools and a joint attack against the state? The state has a $31 billion surplus. They have not raised the level of funding for California schools to #1, even though it's the wealthiest state in the country. Why the silence of the CFT and CTA about this budget surplus and demanding that these Democratic politicians who they've given millions of dollars to actually use that funding for proper funding of the schools in California?
So I think that they basically buy into the same philosophy that destroyed the unions in the big industrial unions in the private sector, the team concept that we can't push too hard. I remember hearing Bob King, at the time, 10 years ago, president of the United Auto Workers, saying Ford's profit is our business, because if Ford isn't profitable, then they can't, they're going to have to lay us off, and they're not going to be able to meet our wage. They'll cut our wages and so on. So we have to work with them. We have to work to make the company more profitable. In public sector unions, what we hear is, well, there's no money. So there have to be some cuts. Let's try to minimize the cuts. So in order to do that, we have to maintain alliance with our friends, the Democrats, because they will cut us less than the Republicans will. So sure, they're going to be cuts. In fact, Steve, in this was in 2009, I think, CTA held seminars around the state, for teacher activist leaders, bringing people together to tell them, make sure that you close your contracts on the existing clauses, accept layoffs. Don't fight the layoffs, because if you do, they're gonna come back and cut wages and benefits. So we need to preserve those by fighting layoffs. So these are not people who are interested in class struggle. They're interested in class collaboration. They believe that's the way forward. So I believe that to have an alternative, we have to have an alternative fight. We have to say we're not going to accept that there have to be cuts. We're not going to accept that there is no alternative, the Margaret Thatcher, TINA. But that's what's accepted by that leadership.
And the CTA and the CFT both now say that they don't like charters, especially if they're not union. But Prop 39, the California charter law passed in 1992, was supported, or the CTA and the CFT went along with it. Prop 39, which was funded by Reed Hastings, a billionaire, was actually supported by the CTA and the CFT. And these charter schools, they have a whole department in the CTA and CFT saying that they have to unionize these charter schools. Isn't that setting up a two-tier system in California public education?
Yeah, and that was set up consciously by them. In 2004, I was at a Region 1, Northern California, coastal CTA leadership conference down at Asilomar in Big Sur. And I went to a workshop on charter schools. The presenters from CTA announced that you needed to essentially have this two-tier. Well, we were going to divide charter schools into the good and the bad ones. And the good ones were the ones that were going to allow us to try to organize. And the bad ones wouldn't. Now, but in order to do this, we had to allow for all kinds of exclusions in the contract for these charter schools. And I said, well, aren't you setting up a two-tiered system now where you are making exceptions for a whole class of schools, the ones that aren't really public schools? Rather than fighting them, you're accepting them. And they trailed me around the conference from that point on.
I guess your question was a little problematic for them.
Yes, a little bit. And then in 2010, was it? I actually did some consulting work, low-paid consulting work, by the way, for the Los Angeles Teachers Union, because I had a reputation at the time for being able to collect information and data on things like charter schools and privatization. And they were planning or wanted to, considering launching an organizing campaign to organize charter schools in Los Angeles together with SEI, one of the big SEIU locals.
99, SEIU 99.
Well, that broke down because SEIU, as bad as CTA and UTLA were, they couldn't compare with SEIU in wanting to. SEIU wanted the charter schools in no questions, no bar, not even a 1 inch to go cross over. These were potential dues. But I found out the entire CTA charter school organizing department at that time, only 10 years ago, came to the meeting, 3 people. 3 people for organizing charter schools in the entire state of California, for one of the richest state unions, maybe the richest in the country, which had a staff of hundreds, which they pay 6 figures to. It's disgraceful.
And one of the issues driving this shutdown of public schools is not only turning them into charter schools, but also selling off the land. It was a lot of valuable land in Oakland and in San Francisco that developers and capitalists would like to get their hands on. What has been going on with the sell-off of public school land in Oakland? And you think that that's behind this effort to shut down schools? They're saying that there are not enough students in the schools and we need to shut them down and sell them off.
Yeah, so this goes back to the original state takeover, the bill for the state takeover. That bill allowed the school board, allowed the state superintendent of public instruction or his agent, state administrator in this case, to have control over one parcel of land they could sell, the central parcel, which had 5 or 6 schools and was located in an area where right on Lake Merritt, where developers wanted to put up, big condominiums. They brought them into the school board and they would present on, well, we're going to feature the great views of the San Francisco skyline and so on and so forth. We managed to push that, to beat that back, but it was very difficult. Subsequent to that, there is a big push now to sell off school land because they have closed so many schools in Oakland that rather than use them to provide for smaller classes and for wraparound services, these sites could be used to deliver essential services to the community. But they're not. It's the same story, which plagues us at every level in Oakland and most other large urbans, which is they wave around austerity, a deficit. They attack and privatize, they make the deficit worse. Then they say, in order to stay afloat, you have to sell off what you have to us. That's what's going on. And the only way around this is by a class-wide struggle in which we say it's in our interest, it's in the interest of the community, it's the interest of all working people to have qualitatively better public education, healthcare, housing, and so on. It goes the opposite way. So they sell off. They're not putting up public housing. They're putting up condominiums. Well, Oakland has become, as you probably know, very gentrified. You know that back in the late 1970s, it was Walter Shorenstein who said, this place is too beautiful for them, referring to Black people. And I believe that's really the attitude, that's behind the scenes. That this is a place that's too good for, for poor and working people. This is a place for the winners in society.
And one of the connections between Oakland and San Francisco is the effort of John Fisher, who's the owner of the A's and the Gap, to get public money to build a stadium. And his family, his wife, Laura, and his mother, Doris, both are on the board of directors of the KIPP school in San Francisco. And they are suing, actually, the San Francisco Unified School District to take over more rooms in the Malcolm X Academy in Hunters Point for their school, their privately run school. And you have these billionaire capitalists running the schools in Oakland. KIPP, not only KIPP, but Rocket Ship. Dave Cavall, who's the manager of the Oakland A's, is on the board of Rocket Ship. It seems that these capitalists, the billionaires, have gotten a grip on public education, and basically there is no campaign against privatization of public education, public services, which is also going on by these union officials. You think these union officials ideologically don't want to fight privatization? They don't want to fight these billionaires?
Yeah, I think they don't. It's Dave Cavall's the president, right, of the A's. Yeah, I mean, they could care less about the quality of life, about the pollution, about the loss of jobs on the Longshore, about turning the city into a traffic grid nightmare, and increasing the pollution qualitatively in downtown, and then in the rest of they don't care about that. They care about, their profits. And who runs the city of Oakland? The developers run the city of Oakland, the real estate developers, and the most of the city council members and the mayor and so on are bad people for them. The mayor of Oakland, Libby Schaaf, what was her job before she became mayor of Oakland? Well, 2 jobs ago, she was the chief of staff for Ignacio de la Fuente, the city council president, who was, completely tied in with the real estate interests. We used to watch his meeting with them down in coffee shops in Jack London Square. Then she became the public relations spokesperson for the Port of Oakland. And, this is, the fix is in, and it's all about money, and they don't give a damn about us. So yeah, they don't care. And you really ought to have a unified response, and not just by local unions. This ought to be the national unions ought to be stepping in here and publicizing this and leaning on the people that they put into office and fund, the Democrats, about these kind of actions here in Oakland, but they won't do that.
Well, if you have a trade union leadership, which we have in the United States, that is openly pro-capitalist, is openly pro-imperialist, the teachers union, SEIU, they've never said we should cut the military budget, $700 billion a year. They basically support US imperialism and capitalist organization of the economy. Do you expect that they're really going to fight these attacks on public education? Because it seems that they're escalating under Democrats. We're not talking about Trump and the Republicans. We're talking about Democrats in California, in San Francisco, in Oakland, and statewide.
No, they're not going to fight it. In fact, the analogy I used to use is that everything is going to hell. And the question is your choice of vehicles. Do you prefer a handbasket or a Porsche? So yeah, that's the difference between them.
And the unification of this fight in San Francisco and Oakland, do you think there needs to be joint activity, joint rallies, joint action, not just in the cities against these board members, but also against Tony Thurmond and Newsom in the legislature? Because in San Francisco, you've got legislators who run, Ting runs the finance committee, chair of the finance committee in the state legislature. You'd think this is something that they could immediately do. They have a supermajority. The Democrats, they could pass money for keeping the schools open and not shutting down using the state trusteeship.
Yes, they could, and they should. And it does require a unified fight, because we have a unified fight against us. The capitalists, are coordinated. You'll see, internecine fighting, but they have, their Bay Area coalitions, and we saw that during the transit strike a few years ago. Where it turns out that you had a coalition, an ongoing grouping with the CEOs of every one of the 500 or so leading companies in the Bay Area, meeting and coordinating on how to beat back the transit workers. So yeah, it has to be taken on that way, and it has to be taken on by first, the Democratic politicians need to be called into account for what they're doing because of the support they're being given. But frankly, as you say, they're pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist. We look at Biden's policy now, and it's the standard old, warmongering policy that started at least with, the trilateralism in Jimmy Carter years. Same people, same policy, continuity. So they need to be called on, but frankly, they're not going to do it, and they have to be exposed for not doing it. If we can build enough from below, the leadership can be forced to take under the heat, to take certain steps. But really, a independent rank and file movement of workers and unemployed is really desperately needed.
And what about the issue of a Labor Party? Because as in the case with the election of Thurmond, the working class really doesn't have a political alternative. The Democrats are presented as the best alternative and the only alternative in California, since there is no working class political alternative. Do you think the Democrats are going to change?
No, I don't. And I think we have to be careful, because this gets into what would be a very long discussion of what's going on in Oakland with, the whole issue of defunding the cops and crime and so on, which is very important. So you have a few city council people, kind of leftish, that are now on the city council. Carol Fife being the best of them.
And she abstained on the ballpark, giving tax money to the ballpark that she said she was against.
Yeah, she did. And the problem is, it's the same problem with, people like Sheila Jordan when she ran, and was elected the Alameda County Superintendent of Public Instruction, when she was at the time socialist, and that you're taking a position in an extremely corrupt city with an extremely corrupt board. And if you don't have a very clear program and idea of how you're going to fight and do that publicly and transparently, you're going to get sucked into the worst kind of stuff, because they're going to say to you, and this is not rocket science, they do it all the time, where's the money going to come from? Well, if we do this, then the state's going to withhold money from us. They're going to well, the state's the Democrat, and then the state does. So then, and then you get Jean Quan, despite her left background, and the others, and you saw what Carol Fife just did, saying, well, what can we do? Because we're faced with these terrible choices, so we're going to pick the one that's least terrible. Yeah, so until there's an alternative to that, it's going to be that shell game. So there has to be a mass alternative. And it seems to me that at this point, we're dealing with such a biased set of rules in this country for electoralism, where it's a loaded two-party system, horribly loaded. You can educate through electoralism, but and carry on. But I've seen, people who take over locally just get stuck into this no-win situation. And there ought to be there ought to be campaigns against the privileged positions, the institutionalization of the Democratic and Republican parties, it seems to me. And instead, what's happening is that institutionalization is getting greater and greater.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Jack Gerson. He was a leader of OEA on the bargaining council statewide, and a rep to that state body, and also is an expert on education in Oakland and in California. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Thanks very much, Steve.